This is chapter 30, section 5, which entails 3 sections, 2 of them relatively brief. I'm going to try and go fairly quickly, so hopefully you've previewed this before watching it in class. And while you preview it, you can obviously pause and take the notes that you need to. So the first section was over hammering out the treaty. And so Woodrow Wilson is in Paris, but he has to come back to the United States, so he makes a quick trip back to America. And when he gets back, he has Republicans in Congress who are known as the Irreconcilables, also known as the Battalion of Death, because they are going to reject whatever Wilson brings back, in large part because of his not taking a single Republican senator with him. Specifically, Henry Cabot Lodge, who we discussed before, was a prime candidate to go with him. So these Irreconcilables or Battalion of Death were 39 Republicans, which alone was enough to defeat the treaty. So Wilson comes back from Paris. They're not done with the peace talks yet. And Congress is basically telling him that they're going to defeat whatever treaty he brings back, and that they're not going to approve the League of Nations in its existing form. What this means for Wilson is he now has a much weaker position to bargain with when he goes back to Paris. So he's going to have to beg the Allies for changes, which means they are going to be able to demand and get things out of him so that they can get what they want. And so he comes to the US, then he goes back to Europe, and here are their demands. So once he's back in Europe, Clemenceau demands some territory along the French-German border, so the Rhineland and the Saar Valley. So taking more from Germany, France is getting some spoils of the war. And so Wilson doesn't want to completely do that, so they reach a compromise, and they say that the French will get the Saar Valley under a League of Nations mandate for 15 years, and then they're going to give the people in the valley the ability to vote whether they would like to be a part of France or the part of Germany. And they do actually do this. They vote 15 years later, and the people overwhelmingly associate themselves as German. So they vote to be returned to Germany. And because of this agreement, France drops the demand for the Rhineland. France also gets out of this a security treaty, and with it, Britain and the United States pledge to come to France's aid if Germany were to invade again. And so we can see what France is fearful of, and that's Germany rising, which, as if you know anything about World War II, was a justified fear. However, and so Wilson agrees to this, but the Senate actually doesn't sign this secret treaty, and so this makes France feel betrayed, and the Senate doesn't sign it because they want to avoid entangling alliances. And so again, if we consider the beginning of World War I and think of the 4 main causes of the war, we've got militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. They're trying to avoid those entangling alliances. Next, Italy and Orlando have demands. And so Wilson wants a seaport called Fiume to go to Yugoslavia. Italy wants control of it because it's a seaport and it has value as a trading post. So Wilson tries to convince the Italian people that it would be better if it went to what Wilson views as the rightful country, which would be Yugoslavia. And so he tries to appeal to the Italian people for this and go over the Italian leaders. But this backfires because the public roundly says no. The Italian public wants Italy to have control of this seaport, and so Wilson is diminished even more on the world stage. Next is confrontations or disputes with Japan. So Japan is wanting to claim China's Shantung Peninsula and German islands in the Pacific. So again, they want some spoils of the war. Japan concedes the Pacific Islands under League of Nations mandate, so a similar situation to what France had with the Saar Valley. However, Wilson opposes Japanese control of the Shantung Peninsula because it is heavily populated. It has 30 million Chinese citizens there, and so giving control of it to Japan would be a clear violation of their sovereignty. And so Wilson, again, because he is in a weakened bargaining position, accepts compromise, and that Japan can keep Germany's economic holdings in Shantung, and they're going to promise to pledge to return the peninsula to China at a date that is to be determined later. And obviously, this angers the Chinese because this is an imperialistic solution. They're not getting Shantung free. Instead of Germany being in control of it now, Japan is. Cartoon in your book, we might actually talk about this, or I've already talked about this with the focus activity. So the next section was shorter, the peace treaty that bred a new war. And so this is a little bit of foreshadowing. So the Treaty of Versailles terms are finally agreed to, and it's given to the Germans in June of 1919. They were not invited to the peace talks, so they're literally just, these peace terms are being hammered out and they're just handed it. And their hope is that the Treaty of Versailles is going to be based on Wilson's 14 points. However, once they receive the actual treaty, they realize that only 4 of the original 23 points were honored. I know it's called the 14 points, but as you guys know from the activity you have done, some of those points include multiple ideas within them, and so that's where the 23 points come from. So 4 of the original 23 points were actually honored, and so the treaty's tone was vengeance, revenge, and not reconciliation. And so this shows kind of the fact that Wilson was overrun by the desires of the other allies, in large part because he did not have Congress's support for the treaty. And so, not surprisingly, Germany is unhappy about the Treaty of Versailles, and they make it known. And Hitler uses this to his advantage when he starts to rise to power in the early 1930s. Wilson himself, he wanted what was best, so that's where your textbook says he was guilty of no conscious charges. He was not trying to make a peace treaty that was unfair to the Germans, but he had to compromise to save the League of Nations. Wilson felt that the League of Nations could fix the other problems that were going to be caused by the treaty. And so he clung to this and was willing to give in other areas. As Wilson is kind of looked back on, he's viewed as a fallen idol, someone who was very much perched highly in kind of the global perspective of him. But as his presidency wore on, he was kind of knocked off that pedestal. Liberals are unhappy with Wilson because they feel like the treaty is too harsh on the Germans. The imperialists are unhappy because they don't feel it's harsh enough, and we'll see a little bit more of that on the next slide. And as I already mentioned, Wilson's hope was that the League of Nations would iron out the inequities of the Treaty of Versailles. So despite all of the weaknesses of the treaty, it did have quite a bit to commend. It led to the liberation of millions of minority people, of dominated groups. So your textbook specifically cites the Polish were free and liberated. And the fact that Wilson was part of the Paris peace talks and the creation of the Treaty of Versailles, it was undoubtedly more fair than had it been left up purely to the European leaders. The final section and the final slide is the domestic parade of prejudice. So when Wilson gets back to the United States with the Treaty of Versailles, he's back for the final time. The Paris peace talks are done. They have a final copy of the Treaty of Versailles. The isolationists protest the treaty, specifically the United States' involvement or potential involvement in the League of Nations, because they view that as isolationist, as us getting involved in world affairs. And so there are all sorts of critics of the Treaty of Versailles. Those who are anti-German feel like the treaty is not harsh enough. and I mentioned that from the last slide, the Liberals thought it was too harsh. It was a gross betrayal to the stated war aims that Wilson had when we went into the war. And then you've got various groups of different ethnic backgrounds. Hyphenated Americans were upset because their homelands were not benefiting as much as they felt like they should from the treaty. We got another political cartoon, which we might also look at in a focus activity at a later time. That is it with this section of notes.